Muted myself. Good morning, everybody. I'm excited for class number 3. This is a little bit, in our trek through modern Jewish history. I said at the beginning that this entire class is a little bit of a educational experiment, and I will delineate a little bit why in the class today. And I'm hoping I'll get some feedback in terms of if this kind of messes us up or if this is an interesting sort of side story. Because traditionally, if we think about modern Jewish philosophy, we started the first week that there's this big academic debate. Oftentimes it gets, very jargony, but roughly speaking, we can ask the question, what makes a Jewish thinker modern? In other words, there's something about Jewish modernity that doesn't just mean a Jew living in the 19th or 20th or 21st century. And we sort of conceptualized modern Jewish philosophy with Jews wrestling with really two distinct features. One was all of the intellectual, academic, scientific ways in which people started thinking about the world, right? So if you were to ask the question, how do Jews engage with evolution? Or how do Jews engage with feminism, right? These are questions that belong in the realm of modern Jewish philosophy or thought, because these are clearly modern phenomenon, and we are applying that to Judaism. The other half of modern Jewish philosophy involves politics and social dynamics, and this was the other half of the Haskalah that we talked about last week with Moses Mendelssohn, and we'll continue to talk next week when we talk about Abraham Geiger and the Reform movement, which is how do Jews argue in Western Europe that they deserve political emancipation and equality? Do Jews need to eradicate their national identity, as some argue? Do Jews need to actually form a state for themselves, as other later thinkers known as Zionists argued, right? How do Jews navigate changing politics within Europe, right? So those are both the questions of modern Jewish thought, but at the same time as Moses Mendelssohn, a couple thousand miles to the east, there arose another phenomenon that we know as Hasidic Judaism or Hasidism. And there is this debate about whether or not Hasidic Judaism belongs in the bucket of modern Jewish thought. Does it belong in the bucket of medieval Jewish thought? Is it sort of something entirely different? And so what I wanted to do today is, one, talk a little bit about this sort of split screen, because everything we've described so far in class is Western Europe, right? So we were mostly focusing on Germany and France, and then eventually the Americas. But in Eastern Europe, social dynamics were also changing quickly. And for those of us who know general Jewish history, which I'm going to assume is almost everybody here, there was actually a much larger Jewish population in Eastern Europe than there was in Western Europe. And so whereas the Haskalah started off as sort of an elitist movement. So if we think about, let's take the year 1770 or 1780, and you ask the question, how many Jews in the world were part of this phenomenon known as the Haskalah? Depending on who you ask, the answer might be a couple of thousand, maybe 10,000, right? If we want to be very liberal. If we were to ask how many Jews by the turn of the 18th century were steeped in, the turn of the by the year 1800, how many Jews were steeped in Hasidic Judaism? The answer, if we're going to be very conservative, was hundreds of thousands. And so at the same time, there was this phenomenon called Hasidism that was emerging, and Hasidism has long been at the root of a lot of vehement disagreement and debate in the Jewish community. One, at its time, and we'll discuss this why in about 20 minutes, at the time that Hasidic Judaism started coming onto the field, many rabbis and traditionalists were extremely opposed to the Hasidic movement. We'll talk about why. In the years since, many academics, the people who want to study Judaism from a scholarly perspective, were embarrassed by the phenomenon of Hasidic Judaism. So Hasidism, as sort of a chapter in Jewish history, was long brushed aside. And people said, well, those were a bunch of, simpletons engaging with folklore. But the real Jews were engaged in, the scholarship, Bible and Talmud and all of that. We'll discuss why. And even just the last question that I want people to think about as we talk a little bit about the history, and then we'll talk about some of the Baal Shem Tov's writings. There's this question of, at the root of the Hasidic movement, was this a radical revolutionary movement, or was this a conservative movement? Now, I'm going to guess many people here's knee-jerk reaction, if you know anything about contemporary Hasidic Judaism, one might think that this was a very conservative movement, a conservative religious, a conservative social, a conservative political movement. But there's a lot of evidence that in the 1700s, with the advent of Hasidic Judaism, this was actually a social revolutionary movement. And we'll talk about why and all of the reasons why. But for all of these reasons, the phenomenon of Hasidic Judaism has long excited much debate in the Jewish community. And so let us share our screen and talk about a little bit of the background here. So now we are dipping back into medieval Jewish history just for a second, just to paint the backdrop of what life would have been like for Jews at the advent of Hasidism. So Poland, and by Poland, I mean, expansive Poland, so much of what we would consider modern Ukraine, a lot of modern Russia, a lot of the smaller states that made up the former Soviet Union, there was a golden age of Judaism there in the 15 and early 1600s. There's a lot of ways to think about this. After Jews got expelled from Spain, which for those that were following along in the first week was 1492, and then Jews were expelled from Portugal a couple of years later, many of those Jews picked up and just started moving east across Europe, and many Jews ended up landing in the wider Commonwealth of Poland. And there was somewhat of a Jewish renaissance in Poland at this time. We can talk about, just the numbers. Some estimates that by the mid-1500s, a third of Jews in the world lived in the Poland Commonwealth. Again, not modern-day Poland, but Poland, Ukraine, Russia, right, all of those various states. And this started what was known as the yeshiva movement. And so in major Jewish centers like Krakow and Lublin and places like that, long before these were sadly, now there's sort of, a sad, really lachrymose irony of history that whenever I hear places like Krakow and Lublin, right, you just immediately think of the Holocaust and ghettos and everything there. But before that, if you were to drop into a Jewish community in the Poland Commonwealth in the year 1560, let's say, and you were to mention Krakow and Lublin, that would be the equivalent of saying, Boston or New York City with the flagship universities, right? So just like, if you were to say, what are the flagship universities in America? And somebody would say, oh, that's Columbia and Harvard and all of those places. It would be very much the same in the Jewish world in the 15 and 1600s. And this is right at the age, and I think I mentioned this the first class also, but this is right around the time that the printing press was allowing very quick and cheap copies of versions. So whereas if we were in your average Jewish community in the year 1200 somewhere, it might be the case that there is one copy of Talmud for the entire community. So if you wanted to learn Talmud as an average person, right, you would have to very much, either try to memorize chunks or you would have to go to shiurim or classes, right? But there was no such thing as this sort of ubiquity of self-study or study with a chavruta or a partner. All of a sudden, advent of the printing press, anybody who wants to can own an entire section of Talmud with all the commentaries. And this very much coincides with this yeshiva movement of this push in the Eastern European Ashkenazi world to saying, everybody should be learning as much Talmud as they can, and when I say this, I mean men should be learning as much Talmud as they can. And again, these places really started attracting the best and brightest from across the Jewish world. This came to a crashing end, and I'm going to, go through the history a little bit quickly here so we can get to the ideas of what makes Hasidism so radical. But in 1648, due to a confluence of social and political factors involving the Cossacks, who were a group of mostly Ukrainian peasants that were upset at Catholic overreach into the greater Poland Commonwealth. If you missed that, don't worry about all the wider details, but essentially in 1648, the Cossacks decided to push as far east as they possibly can in a series of what initially started off as them being upset with Polish and Catholic rule, but like a lot of revolutions in history, it quickly turned into virulent anti-Semitism. And this was led by a man named Bogdan Khmelnytsky or Khmelnytsky. There's many different ways to spell and pronounce his name, as I learned a couple years ago when I was trying to figure out how you pronounce this name. But roughly, once the dust settled, there was about 300 Jewish communities across the Poland Commonwealth that were completely decimated. 100,000 is a conservative estimate, so there were probably over 100,000 Jews dead at the end of this massacre. And the golden age of Jews in Eastern Europe sort of came to a crashing end. And now in the later years of the 1600s and early years of the 1700s, the Jewish world in Ashkenaz was really in crisis, right? It seemed that this terrible set of things had happened. And just like at a lot of other times in Jewish historical crisis, right? We can talk about destruction of the temple. We can talk about the Spanish expulsion from Spain, right? The time was ripe for another revolution, right? And another way to think about this just historically is if everything is going well in life for either an individual or a community, it's less likely there's going to be radical change, right? If things are going terrible, oftentimes that inspires people to think, okay, we need to do something differently. So this explains the Mishnah and Talmud as a new form of Jewish study. We can talk about the spread of Lurianic Kabbalah, which I know we've talked about in other ALI classes before, as a result of the Jewish expulsion from Spain. And very much the Ashkenazi world was going through their own version of this in the mid-17th century with the Chmielnicki massacres. And one set of scholarly rabbit holes that we could go down is much of this Ashkenazi community ended up believing in, quote unquote, the false messiah of Shabtai Tzvi, who we talked about 2 weeks ago. And so this was a community that, again, by the mid 1600s was looking for a savior. This was a deeply religious Jewish community in all senses of the word. And after this terrible physical massacre, this community then underwent what we could only call a spiritual massacre in placing much of their faith in this false messiah Shabtai Tzvi, only to have their hopes come crashing down, 6 months after the Messianic fervor, when Shabtai Tzvi ended up converting to Islam, and the vast majority of Eastern European Jews found themselves in Eastern Europe with almost no social mobility, with having their, many of their family and friends and community members killed in this Chmielnicki massacres, and having a lot of their spiritual dreams and hopes completely dashed. And so this was a community that was probably at one of the lowest points one can imagine in Jewish history. And so very much the Ashkenazi community is undergoing changing times. After the Chmielnicki massacre, after the dust settled and the blood dried, there was still a lasting virulent anti-Semitism that arguably never went away within Eastern Europe. And so this is true in places like Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, right? There's a lot of evidence that the communities there, the average person in one of those countries was much more anti-Semitic than even in places like Germany, who we talked about last week in terms of lasting anti-Semitic fervor there. There was a heavy tax burden placed upon Jews. And so when Jews were physically safe, there was an extreme financial burden. And again, while in Eastern Europe, right, there may be, if we're talking about the late 1700s, there was some talk about Jewish emancipation. There was no talk about Jewish emancipation in Eastern Europe in the 17 and 1800s. And so Jews were in a very difficult, right, there was no social mobility at all. And this was the end of the decline of any type of political autonomy. There was a thing in the 1500s called the Council of Four Lands, which essentially gave Jewish leaders the right to run their little community. Obviously, it's not equal to having a state, but there was at least somewhat political autonomy, and Jewish leadership was able to look out for their community and the people that were living within the Council of the Four Lands. That came crashing down also in the 1600s. And what the Ashkenazi community was left with was the sort of vestiges of this golden age, which included trying to, save this yeshiva movement, which very much did, but Jewish learning became increasingly hierarchical, focused on dialectics within the Talmud known as pilpul. For those that need a crash course in what pilpul is, so we have the Talmud. The Talmud oftentimes has disagreements. Then much of the history of commentary on the Talmud is medieval commentators trying to flesh out those disagreements. So if Tractate A says one thing and Tractate B says another, you might have a medieval commentary from France, say, Tosafot, Rashi's one of Rashi's grandchildren, say, A must be talking about one thing and B must be talking about another. But then you can keep doing that. You can kind of go down a rabbit hole and do Talmud on the Talmud on the Talmud. And the Jewish community and the learning in the Jewish community became increasingly narrow. In other words, what you might expect from a religious community, right? Say you go to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, or even an average Shabbat. What you might want to hear, for most people, is, big ideas about ethics and about God and about community and maybe even some political commentary done in a, nice and neat way. But you want ideas that are sort of a little bit, somewhat grand and somewhat relevant to your life. You probably wouldn't be so happy if every time you went to synagogue, the sermon was a long 45-minute legal briefing on exactly how to read this one line of Talmud with 6 different opinions on it, right? Something that you need a law degree and smicha to be able to understand. But increasingly, the Ashkenazi world in the Eastern European community became increasingly focused on this hierarchical type of study, which also, again, paved the ground for this radical social revolution that's brewing here. I had mentioned this before, but just to highlight again, there was absolutely little to no social mobility. Eventually, there was an area within the former Polish Commonwealth in which Jews had to live in, and that was oftentimes the undesirable area. So Jews weren't allowed to live in a lot of major cities. Jews had to live in what was then later called the Pale of Settlement. And so Jews had, again, no social mobility, very little political power, if any. There was lasting anti-Semitism, and even within the Jewish community, things became increasingly hierarchical, not to mention almost anybody who was living in Eastern Europe, say in the year 1700, had both family and friends who were killed in the Chmielnicki massacre, and also probably had family and friends who had been infatuated and sucked into the messianic movement of Shabtai Tzvi, only for that to come crashing down. And so, oftentimes many Jewish historians sort of warn against painting too bleak of a picture at times in Jewish history. There was the famous, Salo Baron, who was a famous Jewish scholar. He was actually the first person to hold the professorship America. I think it was at Columbia in the 1920s. He put forth this theory of where he essentially said, we have to stop talking about Jewish history as if it's one set of terrible things after another. There was a lot of, silver linings throughout Jewish history. But it's very tough at this point in time in the Eastern European community. Again, I'm sure there were silver linings. I'm sure weddings still happened. I'm sure circumcision still happened, and bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs still happened. And there was times of joy. There was still Shabbat. People still celebrated Pesach and had Seders. But overall, if we take a step back, this was one of the bleakest points in Jewish history with, again, very little ability to change any of the material or physical reality of life, right? There was no way to change your economic reality, no way to change your political reality. And so in a lot of ways, things were stuck and things felt stuck for about 100 years. Now, this coincides, and I'll just finish up the history and then we'll talk about the Baal Shem Tov, with a massive population growth that was happening throughout Europe at the time. This is both Eastern and Western Europe at the same time. But again, in the shaded area, this is the Jewish community that was living in the former Polish Commonwealth. So I know this is I don't know who made this key and decided to make it black and white. But if you look at the year, say 1490, right, this is the beginning of the golden age of Judaism. There was a little bit less than 1 million Jews that were living all throughout Europe. So there was about, say, 700,000. This dip over here around the year 1600, that's the Chmielnicki massacre, where 100,000 plus Jews were killed. But then in the 17 and 1800s, and again, this isn't because only Jews were having more kids. This is, very much we can talk about in parallel with, with the wider European community anyway, with modernity and the Enlightenment. There were huge population booms all throughout Europe, all the way to sort of its apex in the early 1900s, where there was about 9.5 million Jews living in Europe. And then, of course, this is the Holocaust. We're not up to that in history yet, but this is a population growth chart of Jews in Europe all the way from the Middle Ages to the year 2008. And this, for those paying attention to the last 15 years, this line almost certainly is continuing to dip, this time not because Jews are being murdered, but because of immigration. And so there's a lot to say about this this later on, but this coincides, again, with a huge population boom that's happening at the same time, and an entire new generation is essentially being born into a position of just feeling very stuck. And so just to take a step back, and then I usually like starting with texts rather than, talking more about people's biographies, so we'll do text then a biography. The time was ripe for a new type of Jewish community and a new type of leadership that was going to try to address as many of these problems as possible. And so in enters a man who, again, scholars try to piece together the biography of, but we know very little about the person who eventually became known as the Besht or the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. He's sort of this enigmatic figure. And one of the interesting things of scholars when they try to piece together parts of his biography is it's very unclear what is true, what's been applied to him. There's sort of a joke in the Jewish community that any story you can possibly imagine, that was applied to the Baal Shem Tov. And so, right, it's very hard to piece together a historical biography, but we can talk about sort of what the memory of this figure was, because the movement of Hasidic Judaism very much followed the memory of the man known as the Baal Shem Tov. But first, a story. This is a story that, right, it's only fitting that when we were talking about Moses Mendelssohn, we read a dense political and religious treatise and went through it line by line. It's much more attuned to the nature of Hasidic Judaism to talk about a story. Because as we'll see, one of the center ideas within Hasidic Judaism is that Judaism had become too abstract and too philosophical and too elitist. And the average Jew, the simple Jew, the barely literate Jew, the Jew who didn't know a Mishnah from a Talmud and had never heard of, had never been able to read any of the Tosafot or anything like that, that Jew, right, the radical premise of Hasidic Judaism that we'll elucidate a little bit further, the average Jew has just as much of a divine connection to God and an important life mission as the wisest rabbi in the community, right? This was a radical proposition of religious/social equality within the Jewish community. And let's talk about a story here. So in the house of the study of the Baal Shem Tov, he had a child whose wits were dull and who could not even read the letters in his prayer book, much less recite a holy word. His father never brought him along to the city because the boy was completely ignorant. So we have a story of a young boy who is completely illiterate, right? Who knows why this young boy was illiterate, right? It's unclear how old this boy is and everything like that. But, we have a young boy who doesn't really know anything, even the prayers, right? And, for a Jewish community, it's one thing to say that today there's a 14-year-old boy who doesn't know the prayers, right? The reason's probably because they were never brought to synagogue. But if you were in Eastern Europe and you were a 14-year-old boy and you didn't know the prayers, right? That was a much, more interesting phenomenon because you probably had been going to prayer services all your life. So perhaps even, we can speculate this child had a learning disability or whatever the thing was. His father was embarrassed, right? Because back then, if you were engaged very much within the yeshiva world, and much is still the case today, by the way, in certain facets of the Litvak ultra-Orthodox community, that the best thing you could want for your kid is not for them to be a doctor or lawyer, but for them to be steeped and a wise Talmud scholar. And so obviously a prerequisite for being a wise Talmud scholar is understanding much more basic Jewish texts like the prayer book. And so the father was ashamed of his kid, right? Because his kid should know the prayers and his kid didn't. So the father, just never took the kid with him to synagogue. But eventually the boy became bar mitzvah. And once you're bar mitzvah, you have an obligation to pray in a synagogue. And so the father said, okay, I'm going to take you. We're going to go spend Yom Kippur in the main city. And the father also says, right, I don't even trust this kid to not eat on Yom Kippur. And so I'm going to keep this kid with me. We're going to go to synagogue and everything like that. And so now we get a little bit more of the story. Now the boy had a little flute on which he used to play all the time when he sat in the field tending his flock. He took the flute with him from home and put it in his coat, and his father did not know about it. The boy sat in the house of prayer all Yom Kippur without praying because he didn't know. During the additional prayer, the Musaf prayer, he said to his father, "Father, I want to play the flute." His father became terrified and spoke sharply to the boy, as flutes are against Jewish law on Yom Kippur. So the kid sneaks the flute into his coat, and the father, of course, is terrified because, again, halacha, Jewish law, you don't play instruments on Yom Kippur, right? That is a relatively basic law of the halachic celebration or commemoration of Yom Kippur. And so now the father not just is embarrassed from this kid, now this father is absolutely terrified this kid is going to do something to embarrass him. The boy had to restrain himself. During the afternoon prayer, mincha, the boy repeated again, "Father, let me play on my flute." Seeing that the boy wanted badly to play on his flute, his father said to him, "Where is the flute?" The child pointed to the pocket of his coat. The father therefore held the child's pockets in his hand to keep the boy from taking out the flute and playing on it. Holding the pocket with the flute in this way, the man stood and prayed the closing prayer, Ne'ilah. In the middle of the prayer, the boy forced the flute out of his pocket and blew a blast so loud that all who heard it were taken aback. When the Baal Shem Tov heard the sound, he stopped, or he shortened his prayer in the middle. So the child, right, just to summarize, the child ends up forcing the flute out, starts playing the flute, and there's this, hush that happens in the synagogue, and even the Baal Shem Tov, the rabbi of the community, ends up stopping his prayer in the middle. And you can only imagine the, face of the father and the embarrassment there. But after the prayers, the Baal Shem Tov said, "With the sound of this flute, the child lifted up all the prayers and eased my burden. For this child does not know anything, but by dint of his seeing and hearing the prayer of Israel all this holy day, the prayer's holy spark kindled a fire in him, and the flames of his longing burned higher and higher until his soul nearly expired. Because of the strength of his longing, he played the note of his heart truly, without any distraction, for the sole sake of the name of God. Now the pure breath of his lips was very acceptable to him, and by this means all the prayers were lifted up." In other words, what happens at the end of the story, and I'll unshare my screen just for a second, just so I can see everybody. Not only does the Baal Shem Tov say, don't be embarrassed, it's okay, things happen, the Baal Shem Tov ends up flipping it. And the Baal Shem Tov essentially says, this was actually the only instance of authentic prayer that happened all of Yom Kippur. And it's actually due to the merit of this ignorant child who just cares so much that all of our prayers were accepted here. So I'm going to talk about two different aspects of the story, and then we can share some time for thoughts, and then I'll talk a little bit more about just an overview and many of the debates that are sort of at the center of the Hasidic movement. I want to suggest that there's two different levels that we can analyze the story, right? Oftentimes in the Hasidic movement, right, the Baal Shem Tov was very fond of mashals, right? A mashal is a parable. So one way we can view the story is just by its very simple nature, right? Perhaps the Baal Shem Tov is arguing that the Jewish community had become too narrowly focused on what success looks like. And this boy who clearly wanted to have a connection to God, right? Who's to say the only way to connect to God is through the one acceptable channel, right? And perhaps, as many historians have made the argument, including Gershom Scholem, a movement like this actually ends up paving the way to something like the Reform movement, right? This is a radical proposition of Gershom Scholem. But Gershom Scholem's argument, and other scholars who are in this modality of reasoning, suggest that what is liberal Judaism but saying, well, sometimes you have the law, halacha, but sometimes you have the spirit of the law, and sometimes these things are in tension. And sometimes if you can have a more authentic and a more intentional and a more attentive prayer service with, say, instruments, right? Who's to say that, well, instruments are forbidden on Shabbat and Yom Kippur? We don't do that, right? Here, the Baal Shem Tov seems to be implying that, no, there's no one right way to pray. And Jewish law, even if Jewish law is important and should be followed, right, there are times where there's values that actually override Jewish law, right? The outpouring of spirituality from this young boy was not only, he was not only not taken outside and told him very strongly, hey, instruments are not allowed on Yom Kippur, what are you doing here? But the Baal Shem Tov actually applauded this, right? So one way to view this is just the Baal Shem Tov starting to understand and starting to teach to this community of Eastern Europe that, hey, there is more than one way to be Jewish, and it doesn't have to be through the accepted rabbinic norms and rabbinic channels. That's certainly a true way to view this, but I want to suggest on the parable level, the story actually runs one level deeper. So I'll say this and then we can pause for some thoughts or questions. Many have taken the story and other stories of the Baal Shem Tov to actually be parables for the entire Jewish people. What do I mean by that? You have a situation in Eastern Europe that because of lack of social mobility, because of poor economic circumstances, because of the fact that the vast majority of Jews at the time were not able to understand advanced technicalities within the Talmud, right? That the vast majority of the Jewish community can actually be personified as this young boy, right? Most Jews deeply want to have a connection to God and Judaism, but at the end of the day, most Jews just don't have either the time, the money, the backing, maybe the intelligence to spend their entire life at this advanced yeshiva academy, spending their hours learning, the complexity of law. And this was seen as, well, a negative situation before the Baal Shem Tov, right? It was seen as something that one was embarrassed, right? Everybody understood there was one way to be a quote unquote good Jew and one way to connect with God. And that was through, again, the halachic tradition, the Talmudic tradition, the legal Jewish tradition, everything there. The Baal Shem Tov is saying, well, the situation of Jews in Eastern Europe is much like this boy, right? Ignorant, perhaps even illiterate, right? Confused, but deeply spiritual. There's some innate desire within the average Jew, as personified by this young boy, that just wants to sing out and just wants to connect with God. But because of the law and because of the strictures of rabbinic authority and the Talmud, there's something that's actually prohibiting this. And there's actually forces in society that are forcing this kid, right, as personified of the Jewish people, from taking out his flute and playing it. And the Baal Shem Tov is saying, no more, right? I'm going to start a movement and start a trend and phenomenon where the average Jew has just as much of a spiritual connection to God as the rabbi at the front. And everything just has to do with intentionality, authenticity, right? And even to some extent, the subjective religious experience, not necessarily going through the approved channels of rabbinic authority. This very much, right, this story, the push of Hasidic Judaism, and I'll talk about, I have two brought into the mainstream, and then another slide about many of the debates that the Hasidic movement ended up unearthing. But before I do that, I will pause for any questions just on the first half or any comments or anything like that. Oh, go for it, Rhea. Sorry, I didn't see the
Okay,
hand.
sorry again. Okay, it's just that this reminds me, it isn't just in that time, but we have the same, in a sense, we have this now competitive Jewishness. And that, in davening, who's the best davener? Who, in the silent prayer, if you get to sit down first, you really got through it fast, you must be really good. So there's that tendency, and I don't know if it exists in other um, belief systems, but that this story not only fits at that time, but it fits all through how we do Jewish. And I don't, it's a puzzle to me.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, obviously in this story, and in much of Hasidic Judaism, the sort of traditional rabbinic structure is the the foil. So, right, not the good guys. If one wanted to defend the sort of dominant halachic rabbinic, hierarchy there, what one could say, which is exactly what opponents of the Hasidic movement said, which there were many. There was actually an entire movement that were just called the opponents, the mitnagdim, that are sort of still around to today. What they would say is it's a very slippery slope of once you allow simpletons to have just as much of a connection with God, and once you say things don't have to flow through the traditional modalities of Jewish law and the Talmud, Judaism is sort of at risk of becoming more watered down and more splintered, and everybody's sort of doing it their way. And so they were very much trying to keep a community, united. It was a very, the rabbis at the time had a very conservative attitude towards Jewish life. There's all these outside forces that are hurting us, so we need to become more conservative, more insular, focus on, defending our tradition and everything there. The Baal Shem Tov clearly disagreed, right? The Baal Shem Tov was clearly much more of a, social revolutionary type. But yes, you are totally right that we kind of always have this tension. Max Weber, who, many consider him to be the founder of sociology, he had this theory that in a society, you have these two archetypes. You have the prophet and the priest, and the role of the priest. And he was a religious German Protestant, or at least he grew up religious, so he was very familiar with the Hebrew Bible. And he drew upon the Bible oftentimes in his theories. He said, look at the Bible, right? There's two forms of leadership that are genuinely talked about, right? One is the priests, right? And he includes the king and the priest, right? And who are the priests, right? The priests are the people that are in charge of tradition. And this is a, inherited position. And in a lot of ways, the goal of the priest is to make sure things look exactly like they did last week, next week. In other words, we have a tradition. We have to pass this tradition from one generation to the other. The sacrifices in the temple need to be the same next Shabbat as they were last Shabbat, right? That's the goal of the priests, right? And so a much more conservative force, right? He compares that to the prophet. The prophet oftentimes act alone, right? So they're not backed by a whole institution. And these prophets are people who come with this very charismatic message and they're able to get a bunch of leaders. And this is much more of an organic process. So whereas, the priests, they have institutions and there's oftentimes ways in which people get elected to positions in institutions, prophets are people who, right, they don't get elected, but they just get a group of people who naturally follow them and they're able to make political and social change just by dint of their charisma. And these are people that have very non-conservative messages, right? The prophets, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, right? These are people who essentially are going in, looking at the temple and saying, we got to change this whole thing, right? This is all completely rotten, right? And so Max Weber says society is sort of a dance between the priests and the prophets, and you don't want either of them to get all the power. And so, in some sense, right, the Baal Shem Tov was a prophet type, right? He was looking at what was, and he was saying, we need a radical, different direction of what needs to happen here. His opponents understandably disagreed and said, well, you're not going to be left with anything, right? The sort of bread and butter of the Jewish community was law and halacha and Talmud study, and this is what got Jews through some of the darkest times, right? The period, just one more thing I'll say on this, the period amount of the world was always much more fond of Talmudic pilpul than the Sephardic world. Right after the Crusades is when you had this proliferation of Jews looking into the Talmud for pilpulim, because again, it was a very similar circumstance. Jews were looking for a new way to think about the world, and so they became more internal in terms of our text in the Talmud. So there is a lot of tension there, but I said a lot. Any other thoughts and or questions?
Yes, Rabbi. This whole idea of like Jews for everybody, for the common man, is Judaism for the common man. Was it a large part of it based on that rise in population? I didn't realize that was such a steep rise, that also you have so many Jews around. Maybe that the system could not accommodate everyone to be at the yeshiva.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's sort of unclear, right? And one of the things I was going to kind of get to with the debates at the end is there's another meta debate that Jewish historians like to have, which is, are Jewish movements mostly caused by external factors, or are they mostly caused by internal factors? The obvious answer is both, but you always have these two camps. One camp that wants to say, well, the only reason why this thing happened is because of all these external factors, right? There was economic change and social change and political change, factors outside of the Jewish community, versus other people who want to say, no, these were ideas that were organic, that came organically from Jewish thinkers in the Jewish community. So I think you have a little bit of that also. So you certainly have scholars that would make your exact argument, that would say this was just a, population boom, right? There was a lot more, access to information. Gershom Scholem, who I, mentioned, multiple times in class at this point, he actually connects this to the Protestant Reformation, obviously not in terms of the same material, but just in terms of the same general trend of what was happening, of, a move away from elitist institutions. And, just like the Protestant Reformation, right? Everybody should just be able to pick up the Bible and read it. And why do we need, just a clergy who is the only people who understand the Bible, right? So any and all of that. So yeah, okay, let's do a little bit more because I want to make sure to get through a little bit more of the history here that'll set us up from next week. So just a couple of ways to think about Hasidic Judaism. So one, this is an Eastern European phenomenon in the 18th century, really the mid-1700s. I had mentioned the Baal Shem Tov many times here. Another way to think about much of the inspiration that the Baal Shem Tov got, because again, as we had just said, there is this question of, was this due to external factors or was this due to internal factors? For those that sort of have been following along with Jewish history, Kabbalah was mostly a Sephardic Jewish phenomenon, right? the original Kabbalists were in medieval Spain. We can talk about Nachmanides. We can talk about Moses de Leon with the Zohar. Later on, after the Sephardic Jewish community was expelled from Spain, we have in the 1500s and early 1600s people like Isaac Luria of Tzfat, who was coming up with radical new ideas about how the world worked. But these ideas mostly remained in Sephardic Jewish communities, and Kabbalah remained, until Shabtai Tzvi at least, remained mostly an elitist movement. What do I mean by that? Even in the word, right? Today, there's an English word, we say a cabal, right? What's a cabal, right? One, that word is from Kabbalah. But what's a cabal? A cabal is a small group of elitists who are privy to some information that the masses should not be given information to, right? Oftentimes, cabal has later on, now it has oftentimes anti-Semitic undertones, and that is because of the history of its use with Kabbalah, right? That's a whole other rabbit hole. But one of the things that the Baal Shem Tov did is take a lot of these wider ideas of Kabbalah within the Zohar and within Isaac Luria that were at the time very abstract, intellectual, much more elite ideas, and try to package that nice and neatly for the masses. And so we can think of Hasidic Judaism as a populist movement. And just to remind everybody what Isaac Luria taught, one of the big innovations of Isaac Luria, the Arizal, was to say that there's a brokenness in the world, that God, when creating the world, there was some great shattering, right? The Shvirat HaKelim, the shattering of light after God removed himself from the world. And so now the world is in darkness and chaos and brokenness, and there's pieces of light scattered around the world, and that we need Jews to essentially do mitzvot, to raise up the sparks, to bring about the Messianic era, right? That was Isaac Luria. But this very much was seen, one, as a elitist movement. So this might be what the religious teachers knew, but hardly you would be going to, class when you're 10 years old and you would be told by your rabbi, it's up to you, surely, to collect all the sparks of light. Second, and perhaps equally important, the way to collect the sparks was one way. It was doing the mitzvot, right? So Lordianic Kabbalah was still able to be, even with its radical ideas, it was still able to somewhat fit the conservative nature of rabbinic Judaism. Obviously, with Shabtai Tzvi and Sabbatinism, that was sort of Lordianic Kabbalah gone wrong. We've talked about that elsewhere. But for the vast majority of people who followed Isaac Luria's ideas, right, this was not a movement that said, well, if you connect to God more by singing and dancing rather than sitting in a yeshiva studying Talmud, that's just as good. Luria would say no, right? And the followers of Luria would say no. The way you collect the sparks is you do the mitzvot, right? There's a very set of guidelines. All of a sudden, the Baal Shem Tov is taking this idea and tailoring a little bit, very much what we studied with the story of the flute. The Baal Shem Tov says, well, hey, there are many different ways to collect sparks. And collecting sparks and doing your job in the world, right? There's a unique job for every single individual, right? There's a famous teaching of the Baal Shem Tov who says that every Jewish person has a letter, right? So there's this idea that there are 600,000 letters in the Torah, that there were 600,000 Jews that were present at Mount Sinai. And so this was, again, a long idea, a very old idea in the Midrash, but the Baal Shem Tov took this to the next level. And the Baal Shem Tov said, a Torah is not kosher if it's missing one letter. It doesn't matter if that letter is the Aleph of the, Anochi Hashem Elohecha, right? I am Hashem your God, or if it's an Aleph in some guy's name that you speed through whenever you're reading it, right? The Baal Shem Tov says every single Jew is equal to every single other Jew in terms of godliness and importance, right? That's a radical idea. That is not an idea that is going to convince, if you're a 15-year-old and you are finding Talmud study a little bit difficult, right? Every other rabbi would say, well, you just got to keep doing it, right? You got to keep doing it, or you'll just be seen, you'll just be lower on the hierarchy of Jewish community, right? The Baal Shem Tov was saying, no. If this guy is a great shepherd or great at weaving hats or great at playing the drums, that is just as much of an act of religious devotion as the person who's sitting there meticulously studying the Talmud, right? This is a pretty radical idea, right? And again, there's a lot of debate, and I want to highlight the debate so I don't oversell it, right? I don't want to undersell it or oversell it, because there's a lot of debates that are, hoping to form this Overton window here. there's a lot of debate about, just how radical did the Baal Shem Tov push it, right? One of the questions that scholars have is, was early Hasidic Judaism antinomian, right? Antinomian meaning there's very little use for law, right? So obviously, the vast majority of Jews at this time, even in Eastern Europe, would have followed Jewish law. Clearly, Hasidic Judaism devalued halacha a little bit, right? You don't get stories like the flute if you have just as much of a value of halacha as the rest of the Jewish world. But to what extent, right, that's up for debate, right? And it has to do with a whole variety of other things we'll get to on the next slide. But clearly at the root of what the Baal Shem Tov was doing was forming a populist movement based off of equality of people, right? There's also a debate, right? I'll give the footnote here about whether or not we can connect early versions of feminism within the Hasidic movement and everything there. That's another little bit of an aside. And clearly, the Baal Shem Tov de-emphasized halacha and traditional Talmud study, right? That much we know for sure, right? There was more than one right way to connect to God, and it doesn't have to be through halacha and traditional Talmud study as well. And one of the things the Baal Shem Tov often taught, this is in Yiddish, leis alter panui minai. I don't speak Yiddish, so somebody can tell me how well I did, but this idea that no place is devoid of God, which is, again, somewhat of a radical teaching and formulation, because if no place is devoid of God, then you can reach just as much spirituality if you're in the forest as you can in the synagogue. And let's say, for whatever reason, if you do achieve a higher rate of spirituality in the forest alone, say on a camping trip, than you do in the synagogue, perhaps the Baal Shem Tov would say, okay, don't go to synagogue, go to the forest and commune with God, which is oftentimes what many of the early Hasidim did, right? They would practice things called hitbodedut, right? From the Hebrew word levad, right? They would go alone out in nature, right? That's not rabbinic Judaism, right? Rabbinic Judaism would say 3 times a day, if you're an adult male, you go get the shul, daven with a minyan, right? There's a lot of prayers you can't say if you're alone. All of a sudden, the Baal Shem Tov to say, no, there's a place, no place is devoid of God. You can be spiritual really anywhere. And the of hitbodedut is the word devekut from the Hebrew word davak, right, which is union with the divine, which is your goal is to the person to God, and that can obviously be through many forms, including, right, song and dance, and oftentimes even alcohol, and things in which, now for people who have a lot of familiarity with Hasidic groups, obviously Chabad is the most widespread Hasidic group in 2025, right? You're much more likely within a Chabad synagogue to end up singing and dancing and drinking during services than you are in any other Orthodox or non-Orthodox community, right? It's very normal if you go to synagogue a Shabbat morning at a Chabad shul to be given a shot of something and for, random dance and song to break out. And there's a lot of evidence that the Hasidic movement now in 2025 is much more mellow than it was at the outset. And so this, again, very much was a movement that catered to the common folk and average individual, right? I had mentioned meditation or hitbodedut before, but all these other forms of religious practice that before that just simply didn't exist on the mainstream, right? I don't want to make the argument that Jews didn't meditate at all before the year 1700. I'm sure that's false. I'm sure people did it, but that was considered, supplementary to, what makes you a real or good Jew. And all of a sudden, the Baal Shem Tov is, again, giving a radical new definition of what Judaism should be and can be. And again, unlike what was happening in Western Europe, we can sort of toggle back to last week. This wasn't because he was trying to argue for emancipation or try to argue for a reconciliation with the Enlightenment and Enlightenment values. This was much more of an organic type movement because of a lot of, maybe economic and social hardships that the Jewish community was undergoing. So let's talk about just a couple of debates, and then we can see if there's any questions or comments just in the last couple minutes. I think I had mentioned all of these before, but I just want to go through it. I don't know why this isn't popping up one at a time. Let me just edit this real quick. Actually, not. I won't. People just could not read ahead. So one, like a lot of chapters in Jewish history, we can have, a conversation. What were the causes, right? So I think somebody mentioned this before. Is this internal or external causes? In other words, if you're trying to, understand the phenomena of Hasidic Judaism, how and why did this arise? You can make compelling arguments for both, right? One, this could be one natural conclusion of mysticism, right? The mysticism of Isaac Luria. In other words, once Isaac Luria teaches that the sparks are everywhere and that it's your mission to raise up the sparks, the question arises, what if I'm just not smart enough to understand Talmud, right? Talmud is really difficult and really dense, right? Isaac Luria even teaches, I still have a unique mission. So what could that mission be if it's not through the traditional modality? So a logical conclusion could be, it must be through the things I'm good at. If I'm terrible at Talmud study, but I'm really good at drawing or art, even though art is not, right? There's no, line in the Talmud saying, you should achieve holiness through art, but I could express myself religiously through art. The Baal Shem Tov would say, that's great, right? Do your art lishma, right? In other words, for a higher purpose. And that could be just as good as sitting in a Beit Midrash studying Talmud, right? So that's one way to understand it. The other way is obviously focusing a lot more on these social and economic factors that oftentimes underlie any populist movement, right? So, populist movements throughout history are oftentimes, connected, right? You're not going to have a populist movement if everything is going great. Populist movements generally revolve around charismatic leaders, right? Generally, that charismatic leader is saying the institutions and systems that were here beforehand are not serving you well. It would be in your best interest to join some social, religious, political change or revolution that is undergoing here. Oftentimes, populist movements rail against hierarchies, right? You can draw whatever parallels to any populist movement in history you want. And you can understand that just based off of the social and political factors that were on the time, right? Hasidic Judaism is probably just a healthy dose of both. But, if you are so inspired and try to read, a couple books and academic articles about the rise of Hasidism, you'll have one person who says, no, it's mostly this. Another person that says mostly this. The other very interesting debate point that historians like to have is the influence of Shabtai Tzvi in Hasidism. One, right, so the false messiah of Shabtai Tzvi was really right before, right, one or two generations before the Baal Shem Tov. And again, almost all the Jews in Eastern Europe either believed in Shabtai Tzvi or were sort of, hopeful, right? So just like today, right, most people aren't 100% on something, right? Even if you have very strong convictions, it's, well, I probably think this, or I hope this. So almost every Jew in Eastern Europe at the apex of the Sabbatean movement either believed that the Messiah had come or were saying, I don't know, this is very exciting. Do I know? No, probably not, but I deeply hope, right? When this came crashing down, the question that a lot of scholars ask is, well, what happened? Right? There's a lot of interesting social psychological research on cognitive dissonance, right? We have the famous study, Leon Fessinger in the mid 20th century of, if you have a group of people who really believe something, if their belief is obviously dispelled in a public and embarrassing way, paradoxically or counterintuitively, many of them cling to that belief even just stronger, right? So paradoxically, seeing evidence that discredits your view in some percentage of people actually causes people to double down even stronger, right? So many people want to argue that Hasidism was a repackaged, more kosher version of Sabbateanism. This is certainly what the early opponents of Hasidism tried to argue, right? Which is why you have the Mitnagdin movement, right? The anti, right? Neged in Hebrew means, as opposed to, right? So you have the, opposition, led by Vilna Gaon, who was one of the great scholars in the Ashkenazi community at the time, who essentially said that these Hasidic Jews are essentially, they're trying to abolish Jewish law, they're trying to abolish Jewish hierarchy, and they're neo-Sabbatean, right? Shabtai Tzvi, we talked about this the first week, one of the big things that he did is start to argue that law might not be that important, and in the Messianic era, the law is going to be abolished, and oh, by the way, I'm the Messiah, so therefore no more law, right? Law is abolished, right? And this is why in the first week, we said that many scholars want to argue Shabtai Tzvi is the beginning of Jewish modernity because he was the first thinker in Jewish history, right? Him and Spinoza, who were, at the same time, to say maybe Jews don't all need to follow Jewish law to a T, right? So it's pretty obvious why one could connect that to the movement of Shabtai Tzvi and to say, okay, for everything Shabtai Tzvi did, the Hasidim do, but just a little bit tempered down. So, right, the role of Shabtai Tzvi as the Messiah, okay, the Hasidic movement has Rebbes, and a Rebbe is a quasi-messianic, almost, in some communities, maybe even a quasi-divine figure who is a lot more hierarchical than any other form of rabbinic leadership, right? Hasidism is obviously a little bit less focused on the strictures of halacha and everything there. Other people want to argue that no, Hasidism has very little, if nothing, to do with Shabtai Tzvi, and perhaps even more so, all of the pathologies that were inherent in Shabtai Tzvi were actually very much, the Hasidic movement started off against that, right? So there's a really compelling essay about this, I'm forgetting who wrote it, that essentially says Shabtai Tzvi was a, messianism gone wrong. So what did the Hasidic movement did? The Hasidic movement forced Jews to turn inwards. So what the Hasidic movement did, and this is, many teachings in the Hasidic community say there's an external world and an internal world, and most of the drama happens internal, right? So just one example, right? Every year we read the Passover story about leaving Egypt. We believe that to be a historical narrative about an entire community. The Hasidic leaders would say, this is actually a story about each and every one of ourselves, right? There is a Egypt inside of each one of us, and we are all we are all enslaved to something. And the story of the Exodus is us leaving from our own internal bondage to whatever we feel enslaved to, right? And so there's a lot of very interesting evidence that the Hasidic movement said, well, focusing on these big external things such as messianism, right? That ended very negatively with Shabtai Tzvi. So we need to turn Judaism to more of an inward focus. But this debate really raged in the Jewish community for about 100 years between the Mitnagdim and the Hasidim. And even now, when you read academic accounts of the Hasidic movement, you have some scholars who want to argue that they are more Sabbatean-like, other scholars that want to argue this has nothing to do with Sabbateanism. Just two more things to point out here. We can also sort of connect the debate about Hasidism to the Ashkenazi versus Sephardi debate. One of the things that the Baal Shem Tov brought to the Ashkenazi world is a lot of Sephardic modalities of Judaism. The Sephardic community was always more interested in Kabbalah and less interested in strict Pilpul Talmud study, right? Even today, if you go to a Chabad shul for Shabbat, Chabad is as Ashkenaz as it gets, right? Straight out of Eastern Europe, a Hasidic movement. But you open up the Siddur, the Chabad Siddur is a much more similar to a Sephardic Siddur than a traditional Orthodox Ashkenazi Siddur, right? And there's a lot of interesting historic reasons to that, but mostly because the Baal Shem Tov was dipping into this alternative tradition through the Sephardic world, which again, very much upset much of the Ashkenazi rabbis, because if you're an Ashkenazi rabbi, right, you want things to be done your way. And so that can also explain a lot of the tension. And just the last thing I'll say is the sort of lasting debate of whether or not the Hasidic movement was a revolutionary movement or whether it was a conservative movement. I'll say two things on that. Clearly, at the time of the Hasidic movement, this was a very revolutionary movement. But there were two big things that happened in Jewish history. I mean, there are many more since the founding of Hasidic Judaism. One is the Haskalah eventually getting to Eastern Europe, and the second is the Holocaust. And there's compelling evidence that both the Haskalah creeping eastwards and then subsequently the Holocaust, each one in turn made the Hasidic movement much more conservative than it was before the event. And so whereas if you were to drop into and I'll unshare my screen for a second, if you were to drop into a synagogue at the first or second generation of Hasidic Judaism, this would seem like this radical revolutionary movement. Today, if you spend time in a Hasidic community, Satmar, Chabad, Breslov, it would seem a little bit different than an average Orthodox community, but it would seem 98% the same, right? There would be some vestiges of, again, the dancing, the singing, the drinking, but mostly you would say this is just another Orthodox synagogue. And this is because, again, once the Haskalah crept eastwards, the Hasidic Mitnagdid split, right? They were both still what we would consider Orthodox. So in a lot of ways, they joined forces against the forces of secularization. And so by the mid 1800s, you didn't really have this animosity, right? At the time, the Vilna Gaon, who was the leader of the anti-Hasidic movement, he actually excommunicated the Baal Shem Tov, right? And an excommunication is not like, oh, hey, please don't come to, class anymore, you're disrupting. It was, to some extent, a little bit less than a death sentence. It was, you should be hated, you should be shunned, your kids shouldn't be able to get married, you should have no opportunity for any economic. But because of the support that the Hasidic movement had, right, obviously that didn't work, right? Hasidism spread from community to community. And then, of course, once you get to the Holocaust, the entire Hasidic community today, which is split between Israel and really New York, is very much, to some extent, a shell or a vestige of itself pre-Holocaust. And again, these were communities that had lived in these areas for 600, 700, 800 years. All of a sudden, the Hasidic community was decimated during the Holocaust, and trying to reinvent a community, in America or Jerusalem is really not that easy. But just the last thing I'll say, and I know we're at 2 minutes over, is that many of the interesting Jewish Zionist leaders, the revolutionaries of Zionism, actually came from Hasidic backgrounds. And so the spirit of Hasidism still kept its sort of revolutionary tendencies. One of the most famous is Echad Ha'am, but many others. Rav Kook also, came from a Hasidic background. And so Hasidism paved the road for Jews, even within a framework of Orthodox Judaism, for thinking about the world in much more revolutionary and radical ways. And it wasn't just the maskilim or the reformers that were thinking, hey, we have to completely change Judaism. Hasidism sort of proved you can remain kind of within the Orthodox world, right? With full belief and everything, with, mostly full allegiance to the mitzvot, and you could usher in, some type of revolution within the Jewish community. I'm happy to hang out, and if there's a couple questions, I do apologize for going a few minutes late, but thank you all.